Welcome to the program today. My name is Mondo Gonzales, here with a prophecy update, and I have a special guest in studio, Bill Salus. Welcome.
Mondo, it's great to be in studio with you again.
It is always great to have you here, especially when it seems that the Middle East is simply just a powder keg. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about was really the latest news that's going on and then the potential for prophetic fulfillment, especially with the JCPOA. We have it up on the screen. We got some PowerPoints today. Let's kind of give a little history about where it's been and where we're at today.
Yeah, we'll just go back to some brief history, back to the big deal in 2018, May 8th, when Trump stood on his promises to back out of the JCPOA deal. He withdrew America from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And then since that time, Iran has become very non-compliant with respect to their behavior. They've used it as a license to fast forward their nuclear program, which is now becoming a real problem for Israel and the international community. Before I get into some of these headlines that tell you how bad it's gotten, as we sit here today, they've had over 10 months of talks, 8 rounds in Vienna, and not been able to come to a conclusion on what to do if they can reinstate this JCPOA. Meanwhile, Russia's been lobbying against, to remove the sanctions on Iran and let them still build their nuclear reactors, right? What have you heard on that?
Yeah, I mean, as we think about this, one of the things that we're doing here is our goal is not politics. Okay, so we're not a political thing. Our goal is the gospel and to preach the kingdom. But so we're not. We don't have loyalty to any specific administration of any kind. But when any administration, regardless of who it is, conservative or liberal, when they make decisions that threaten Israel, we want to bring those up. And so in this current situation, what I find really just shocking is that we have asked, the current administration has asked Russia to negotiate with Iran on our behalf. So if you think about that in terms of here we are, Iran won't even be in the same room as our delegates. And so we said, well, Russia, can you be the mediator? And so now what we're hearing is that part of the lifting of the sanctions, which really opens the bank, it opens the coffers for Iran to get, $100 billion or more. But Russia just happens to be the recipient, or would be, of $10 billion to build their future reactors. So it's like, again, it's inviting the fox into the hen house and saying, hey, can you make sure there's no eggs? They're getting a piece of the pie. So it's amazing what's going on.
It's very bizarre because Russia, of course, is in the midst of invading Ukraine. That war's still going on. Russia's part of the JCPOA. Again, like you said, they're in Iran's pocket, if you will, because they got these nuclear contracts with them. Basically, the situation is getting way out of hand when you look at this with what Iran's been getting away with. And Iran's whole thing in negotiating has been get rid of our sanctions.
Yeah.
We don't want to roll back our nuclear program. So rollbacks are not really becoming much of an option. It's been getting rid of the sanctions.
Well, let me add one more thing on there, because even the latest sanctions that many nations of the world have come against Russia, by asking them to be a part to negotiate on our behalf, they're saying, well, whatever you negotiate, that'll be outside of any sanctions. So if you get $10 billion for the nuclear reactors, our sanctions that we're putting on you won't be affected. I mean, you think, what in the world? Who's making these decisions?
Well, it's such a crazy time right now. Okay, so let's look at a few historical headlines here. Before the JCPOA was consummated in July of 2015, we got a headline here from Reuters in August 2014. John Kerry, who was trying to negotiate the JCPOA at that time, says Iran is at a 2-month nuclear weapons breakout. So that was back then in 2014. One of the reasons they were trying to hasten together the JCPOA. Since that time, we've had all these other things go on since we withdrew from the JCPOA. September 9, 2019, Iran announced advanced centrifuges and higher enrichment. So they started moving forward quickly after Trump withdrew. September 2020, the BBC says Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is now 10 times the limit allowed in the JCPOA. That was 2.5 tons of enriched uranium. And then 2 headlines came out in January of 2021. Wall Street Journal says Iran begins enriching uranium to 20%. They were supposed to cap it off around 3 to 3.5% or something like that. Now it's to 20%. January, in Israel National News, Iran rolls out 1,000 new additional advanced centrifuges. So they're not slowing down or rolling anything back. And then lastly, the most critical one of concern, April of 2021, Iran is enriching uranium to 60% its highest level ever, which is a stone's throw away from 90%, which is when you have can make a nuclear weapon.
You know, let's talk about this for a minute, Bill, in the sense that, you know, when you think about, again, politically what has happened as it relates to some of these. Some people, like what you mentioned here, some people are criticizing Trump for pulling out unilaterally and causing, so they would say that his decision to do this caused Iran to run free. But what often is not shared was one of the reasons that he pulled out was, number one, it was a bad deal to begin with, which Netanyahu said, but they still, in the midst of all of this, refused to allow the inspectors to come. So all these things were going on behind the scenes, and one of the ways in which it has come out is from 2015 when it happened, was that there were several things that Israel did covertly in order to set them back. So you can't just blame it, I think, on Trump here or his decision to remove, because I guess it would say this: are we saying that Iran has always been a wonderful, trustworthy partner that never lies from the beginning?
No, they're not a rational actor. And we can't roll back the pages at this point in time. And Iran is not going to roll back their stops they're non-compliant right now, and it's going to continue at this level as far as we can tell. They're not really being forced to roll back, as we can see so far.
Yeah. Well, even a couple days ago, one more thing to add on this is, you know, Benny Gantz, you know, he's the defense minister for Israel right now, at least under the current government, which is fragile as we speak. But he mentioned that they've gone from 10 kilograms up to 50 kilograms. And so here we have this, this really coming to a precipice which has been on the brink for so long. Again, Israel has forced it to be delayed, but they recognize that the time for delay, all their covert actions, you know, software hindrances and other things, it's not going to happen.
There's going to come a time where the covert is going to be overtaken by the overt.
Yep.
They're going to probably have to attack Iran. They're prepared to do that. There's another thing, you know, no matter what the negotiations come out to be, Israel's made it a point that they're not going to be bound by whatever the JCPOA puts together. This is a headline from Naftali Bennett about Israel will not be bound by any nuclear deal with Iran. And this has been echoed by Netanyahu and prior. And we're in such a livid situation, we don't even know the fate of Israeli's parliament right now, because Edith, what's her name, Edith Silman?
Edith Silman.
Just stepped away and took away the majority from the coalition that Bennett and Lapid had put together. Yeah,
if you haven't heard about that, Edith Silman, she's a part of the Yamina party, which is the same party as Naftali Bennett. You know, Israel, their government, their Knesset is very different. We pretty much have a two-party system. Israel, there's 10, 12 parties, or sometimes even more or less, depending on the particular election year. But they have to come to a coalition. There's 120 Knesset members. So Edith Silman, she didn't like what she was doing, so she stepped out of the coalition, and now it's 60-60. So it's not that Naftali has lost the position, but if one more person defects, it could throw the whole thing, and then they would have to go back to form a government. And it's interesting that it's kind of like what we have in our government, Bill, where you know, some of these votes in the Senate that are deadlocked, one person becomes enormously influential. And so then there's another, I don't remember the name of it, but the name of this particular gentleman, but he was part of the Knesset, and now I think he was more of the religious side, but he was making demands. So now all of a sudden, you can make all these demands, and if you don't, I'll walk. So each individual has tremendous power that could sway, and he could be gone within a week.
Right, and meanwhile, Iran is continuing to move forward rapidly.
Yep.
Out of control, non-compliant with their nuclear program. And they're a force to be reckoned with, and they've made serious threats to Israel. I want to rifle through a couple headlines to show how livid this threat really is to Israel, and why they may have to act unilaterally without the support of their allies and that sort of thing. This is, Iranian commander says, we can destroy Israel in under 8 minutes. You know, they have ballistic missiles that they can send over, and in 8 minutes they can hit all kinds of parts of Israel, Tel Aviv, the Mondo nuclear reactor, things like that. And those things can actually have nuclear warheads put on those when those are available to Iran. So that's a
But even conventionally, I mean, conventionally right now, the conventional warhead, again, all they got to do is transverse Iraq and a little part of Jordan or Syria, and they're there.
And they want to wipe Israel off the map. Another Iranian general says Tehran aims to wipe Israel off the global and political map. They're not joking around. These are very serious threats, and Israel takes them that way. Not only just the generals, but Ayatollah Khomeini has come out and said, Iran's leader says Israel is a cancerous tumor that needs to be destroyed. So, you know, they're putting Israel in a position where, one last headline here, where they've got to act, they've got to prevent Iran from even the possibility of being able to wipe them out, because if they get a couple of nuclear warheads, they could take out the nation of Israel.
You know, talk about for a moment, you know, is this just rhetoric? What is the root of all the Ayatollahs? Because he's not the first one, but the Ayatollah ideology or religious thinking, even their eschatology. What motivates it? Is this just talking, or what are they after?
Well, no. The first Ayatollah Khomeini was in 1979, and he's the one that initiated the terms Israel's the little Satan and America's the great Satan. And their Islamic eschatology is that if they create an apocalyptic condition, especially if it's with Israel, in the Middle East, it'll hasten the coming of their Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah. And they're Shiites, and Iran's got control over many proxies in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, although they're Sunni, is the proxy of Iran. The Houthis down there below, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, some Shiite militias in Iraq. They're trying to spread their hegemony and establish an Islamic Shiite caliphate throughout the Middle East and throughout all Islam. So a nuclear weapon shifts that whole balance of power. And if they do engage in a war or get attacked and retaliate, they'll call their proxies to the front and center as well. And they basically would think this may hasten the coming of their Messiah, the Islamic Mahdi.
Yeah, you think about that for a moment. You think in terms of when you are seeking to negotiate with someone who wants your complete annihilation and destruction, that you've ceased to exist. I mean, and people will joke and maybe be try to be witty and say, well, can I meet you halfway? I mean, what does that really mean, to meet somebody halfway that wants to absolutely destroy and annihilate you off of the face of existence? I mean, that's what's made it so difficult. And even with these latest talks, Israel is not seated at the table, right?
No, and Iran will not negotiate with Israel. It takes two to tango.
Yeah.
You know that, and Iran's not interested in any kind of relationship with Israel at all. Some of the Arab states are forming a relationship. Of course, Jordan and Egypt have peace treaties with Israel. They're fragile. Saudi Arabia is allowing Israel to use their airspace in the event they want to attack Iran. Bahrain and UAE is forming relationships to the Abraham Accords with Israel. But Iran's not going to go there at all. They want nothing to do with that. You were talking about Benny Gantz earlier. He's the defense minister of Israel. And he's told the U.S., I've ordered the IDF to prepare a strike against Iran. Now, that was at the end of December 2021. So they're prepared to go it alone and attack Iran. And that leads us to a concern about, well, if they invade Iran, would that lead to a fulfillment of a biblical prophecy? Because there's a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49 that actually deals with, it seems like it's got nuclear implications about Elam.
Yeah, I really want to discuss that, because in addition to that, ordering the IDF to be ready, you know, it's one thing for the defense minister to make an order, but what happened as well was, and it's worth a headline, you know, in the sense that the Knesset, this very fragile coalition, they agreed, including the Arabs, surprisingly, they agreed to fund $1.5 billion to begin to train and provide all the necessary equipment and connections, etc., for a strike on Iran's nuclear capacities. So it's not just that it was, in addition to the order, now the money's there. So that was, you know, again, a few months ago. So they haven't been sitting idle in the last few months. And that's one of the reasons why we bring this up, is because I would say, I won't speak for you, but I can imagine that we don't think much is going to happen from this JCPOA agreement.
No, and we may wake up one morning real soon and see an invasion, an attack, of Israel going against Iran.
Yeah.
They're saying we're willing to do it, we're prepared to do it, we may have to do it.
They have to do it.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at some of the history of, like for example, you take the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I mean, Israel was on the brink of losing really its state. It was a surprise attack on a holiday, so they weren't prepared. Their mobilization of their reservists took extra time, again, because it was a holiday. It was a stroke of genius on behalf of their enemies to attack them at this time. But it became so dire that you have stories of Golda Meir having her hands on the nuclear weapons, their own, unavowed nuclear weapons that they were going to launch. And again, when you think about that, Israel is willing to launch a nuclear strike to preserve their own existence. They have neutron bombs, which are very special. But it leads us into understanding the biblical perspective, which is where I want to ask you about. Talk to us about Jeremiah 49, which seems to have these sort of nuclear implications.
I do want to do that. I want to make a comment first to preface this. When you talk about Israel preempting a strike against a nuclear reactor, there's historical precedent in modern history for them doing that. Mm-hmm. They hit the Osirak nuclear facility in Iraq in 1981, I believe it was.
1981.
And in Syria in 2007, the Al-Kabar, Syria was building a nuclear reactor. They call it the Begin principle, Menachem Begin. Israel's prime ministers are familiar with this. Menachem Begin was the founder of the Likud party. He became the prime minister of Israel in 1977. And he was the one who decided to go, after consulting with all of his top confidants, to take and strike unilaterally, without the support of any other nations, preemptively, Iraq. This happened again in Syria in 2007. So the Begin principle, and these Netanyahu, Bennett, these prime ministers of Israel, they're familiar with it. Yeah. So to preempt a strike against Iran has got historical precedent within Israel's prime ministers.
Yeah. And you have to remember too that, in our country we don't often think about it, but if you have those that, maybe you have friends that are Jewish, or maybe especially ones that are older, or you even get into studying anti-Semitism, which we've done here on this show with Olivier Melnick, the psyche of those, especially the Sabras, the ones that have been living in Israel, born there, they are raised with this idea of never again in the terms of the Holocaust. So they know that the world is capable of turning a blind eye and to allow, whether, again, you see it maybe the Jews in Ukraine, or certainly Hitler, that the world turned a blind eye to allow the genocide. And so they're sensitive to the fact that at the end of the day, the only one that they will say we depend on, that we can trust, is ourselves. So they don't mind being a pariah. They already are a pariah in the eyes of the world, especially the United Nations, human rights, blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. So that would lead us to the potential that if Israel does strike Iran, it could lead to the fulfillment of a Bible prophecy. Yeah. And Iran is a subject of two prophecies in the end times. One is in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39, dealing with the territory of Elam. Jeremiah wrote this around 596 BC. We've got an image we want to show you where that Elam is. Mm-hmm. The other prophecy that's unrelated to this one is in Ezekiel 38, verse 5, where Ezekiel talks about Persia. And that's in the Ezekiel 38 Gog of Magog invasion. So we've got two different end times prophecies. They both happen in the latter years. Jeremiah is dealing with Elam, which is, you see in the shaded area on the map. He wrote it about 10 years before Ezekiel wrote Ezekiel 38:5. And that's where the Bashar nuclear reactor is, right there. And it's a dangerous spot. Now, you talked about Russia. I'm going to show another image here. Mm-hmm. Getting $10 billion to help build more nuclear reactors. Well, they're in contract with Iran to build Bashar 2 and Bashar 3 in this region here. So these are nuclear facilities. Bashar 2 is supposed to be done by 2024. Bashar 3 is supposed to be done by 2026. In addition, you have, I'll show an image here, right there in that Elam area, just sort of set the geopolitical and military stage, is where Iran has missile silos, underground silos, and rocket launchers. That's why they can get a missile from that closest part of Iran on the west to Israel in 8 minutes. So this whole territory right here is a very dangerous hotspot for Israel, and it's likely to be where they'd have to start attacking. This prophecy we're going to talk about, it says they're going to break the bow of Elam. In other words, it looks like they're going to go after their missile launchers.
So reiterate, if you will. I mean, we want people to understand that this is not Ezekiel 38 and 39. We see that as being subsequent to the Jeremiah 49 Elam prophecy. But if Israel was to do a preemptive attack on these nuclear sites, again, with an act of self-preservation, and what I mean by that is, if you go back to the 1967 war as an example, Egypt had all of its planes lined up on its runway. And because Israel felt threatened, because Egypt was putting their troops at the border right there, really at the Suez Canal area, and they were there. Israel preemptively bombed all of their planes while they were on the runway. I mean, took it out in one shot. And so this was before they were even attacked. But so Israel's not opposed to preemptively striking something when they feel threatened. And even back then, they were grander. They ended up with more territory, as you know.
Well, so they've heard the threats, they've read the headlines, we've got missiles that can destroy you in 8 minutes. And they may be saying, well, that ain't going to happen.
Yep.
No, we're going to take those underground silos, we know where they are, where those portable rocket launchers are, and we're going to disable those. We're going to knock them out. And they would sort of have to do that because Iran would retaliate if Israel starts attacking any nuclear facilities.
Yep. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the prophetic scenario here, because we can talk conjecture about the current geopolitics, but prophetically, what do we see?
Right. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39. I'm going to give you a summary here of this prophecy. It's only 6 verses. The thing that happens with Iran, at some point, the Lord gets really fiercely angry with them. And as a result, he's going to bring about a disaster. Then we find out the reason he's fiercely angry with them is they've got bad leadership, because the prophecy says he's going to destroy from there the kings and the princes. So they've got bad leadership. And they're angering the Lord, but why? Because they want to launch something lethal somewhere. This is what Jeremiah seems to be saying. And the Lord's not going to allow that to happen. He says he's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might. Now, if you take an archer's bow and break it, he can't, I don't care how many arrows he's got in his quivers or how many ballistic missiles he's got in his arsenal. If you take away the missile launchers, rocket launchers, you can't launch those. And the clue is at the foremost of their might, meaning probably at the height of their nuclear program. Should they get a nuclear weapon, this would be all bets off. Israel cannot handle that, allow that to happen. This appears to have nuclear implications because we find out in the next couple passages that when this disaster happens, it says the Lord will bring 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven and scatter the indigenous population, the exiles that are affected by the disaster, into the 4 winds, into the nations' dispersion. Worldwide, it says there'll be no nations where they don't go into the nations of the world. So it sounds like a humanitarian crisis emerges as a result of this disaster, and they're scattered amongst the winds. Now, and that's an idiom for a worldwide scattering. Zechariah also brings it up, I'll gather the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven. But it says that Elam will be, when this happens, Iran, Elam, that's one section of Elam, will be dismayed before their enemies and before those who seek their life, and that the Lord will send the sword after them until he has consumed them. So these are important clues. At the time, sending the sword would be referring probably to a military invasion, not necessarily an earthquake or something like that, because Iran is a very seismic country. But no, it sounds like it's going to be a military invasion, and it says that Elam will be dismayed before their enemies. At the time this happens, Elam has enemies, plural. Well, Israel's already talking about, we'll go take them out. Yep. The international community is very concerned. They're trying to negotiate the JCPOA. They don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. That's the Gulf Cooperation states right across the Gulf, there's, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE. They don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. That's why some of them are joining the Abraham Accords, UAE and Bahrain. And then, so those are the bad news for Iran. There's some good news for Iran in the last 2 verses. We'll talk about those in a minute. But I want to take a moment on this. And it doesn't tell us which enemy is the Lord's going to send after. It could be a coalition, or it could be, like we say, Israel acting preemptively on their own, and they're saying we're prepared to do that unilaterally. So we don't know who's going to do it, but whoever is going to do this, it looks like it's an unfulfilled prophecy. And what's going to happen is it's going to create a disaster, probably of epic proportions, probably a humanitarian crisis, probably nuclear. Depending on when they do this, remember there's already the Bashar 1, there may be Bashar 2 and Bashar 3. They could start hitting those missile silos. Next thing you know, that it gets out of hand. Iran calls their proxies to come against Israel, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. Houthis say they can lob missiles into Tel Aviv, precision guided, all the way down from Yemen. This stuff could happen real soon, Mondo, and that's when you could get into Isaiah 17. You could have the destruction of Damascus could happen as Israel has to fight back and take out Iran's proxy of Damascus in Isaiah 17.
Yeah, there's so much here because when you think about, again, all these actions that are precipitating and building up, again, as we know, Ezekiel 38 and 39 is there on the horizon, whatever that means, but it doesn't happen overnight. All these things seem to contribute, and it's like an accumulative progression to where, Israel has already been singled out lately by Russia. When they first invaded Ukraine, it made headline news where Russia, the defense minister there, came out and said, well, we don't recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And then just recently at the United Nations, a certain committee, they voted to not recognize the Golan Heights either as sovereign Israeli territory, even though you go back and Trump did. Trump was one of the only ones to recognize Israeli sovereignty a couple of years ago. But this is all a big deal. If they attack and they destroy this freshly built $10 billion of money of Russia, they're not gonna become friends with Russia anymore. I mean, any more than they already possibly not are.
No, and you can't imagine, especially let's say if it's Israel or anyone that attacks Iran, but let's say Israel, that Iran's going to play possum. They're going to retaliate. Yep. And we already talked about the theology. We don't care if there's an apocalyptic condition. Yeah. It might do us a favor to hasten the coming of the Monty. So this is a very livid situation. We could wake up and see this happening. We could wake up to see Iran levying a proxy war. Mm-hmm. There's very grave concerns for Israel because they're surrounded by enemies with powerful weapons. They're not throwing stones at the Jews anymore. They've got powerful precision-guided missiles. So for instance, here's a headline, Hezbollah to the north of Israel, a proxy of Iran. It says that in Jerusalem Post, August 31st, 2019, to the right side of the slide there, Hezbollah has enough precision-guided missiles for confrontation. Israel may be hit by 2,000 missiles a day in a future war. By the IDF general says that's Hezbollah alone, 2,000.
That's just a few weeks ago.
Precision guided.
Yeah,
they could hit.
Those are huge. I mean, these aren't like your little rocket launchers. I mean, these are big.
No,
deals.
These aren't the indiscriminate Scud-Ds that Saddam Hussein lobbed into Israel in the Gulf War. That hope they
random.
They landed in the desert and that sort of thing. Now these are going to hit the pinpoint accuracy. They're going to hit their targets. And Hezbollah has already said we have a bank of targets, and those targets are not going to be grocery stores down the street. They're going to be Dimona, nuclear reactor, Ben Gurion Airport. Here's an article on Press TV, May 13, 2019. Gaza, where the Hamas are, they boisterously said, we can match Hezbollah and can fire 1,000 missiles a day into Israel. Now, recently they lobbed, I think, almost that many missiles into Israel. A lot of them were headed toward Tel Aviv, and if the Iron Dome did not take those out, there would have been a lot of Israeli casualties in Tel Aviv. The other thing, too, is Syria is involved, and Syria's got chemical weapons. Here's a headline, NPR in February 2017 at the bottom of the slide. More than 300 chemical attacks by Syria was launched during the Syrian civil war, the study says. So if you can think that Iran's going to come, and if they still have the capability to send ballistic missiles in 8 minutes, Syria's sending chemical weapons in. You got 2,000 missiles coming from the North Hezbollah, 1,000 missiles coming from Hamas in the Gaza area. Israel cannot withstand that sort of attack. And I think that's when they say, listen, we're going to take out Damascus, because we find out in Isaiah 17, there's a prophecy about Damascus. If we have time, we'll talk about that, those particular couple of verses that talk about Israel being responsible for destroying the city of Damascus overnight.
Yeah. The Bible tells us to keep watching. Jesus himself, Mark 13:37. And so when we come and one of the reasons that we do these prophecy updates is for that reason. We want to be obedient to the Lord's command. We're not here to, it's not our goal to instill fear. In fact, this should encourage our faith to know that all things are falling into place. Talk a little bit about that for someone who's watching. Maybe this is the first time they're coming. We have a lot of new people watching our programs. What's the goal of all this, Bill?
Well, biblical prophecy, especially the ones that seem to be staring us in the face right now, the ones we talked about with Iran and Damascus, this is information God has given us to draw us toward Him. It's invaluable information that authenticates His sovereignty, and we should be thankful for Him and worship Him for that. It's not because He has a lot of information and too much time on His hands, and He wants us to know this stuff. And He wants us to know this stuff so we'll be drawn toward Him for thanking Him for giving this information. We talk about Damascus getting destroyed. I spoke at a Bible study one time, and I went through the whole study, and one of the guys came up to me afterwards, and I was talking about Damascus. And he said, you know what? If I see Damascus get destroyed, I'll become a believer. Okay, there's a prophecy fulfilled. I said to the guy, I said, you know what? Jesus Christ is going to come get His bride in the rapture of the church. He's going to catch the believers up into heaven. They'll be together with Him forever. And that could happen at any given time. Damascus could happen at any given time. There could be a photo finish. What if Jesus comes and gets us out of here, and shortly thereafter Damascus gets destroyed? You should not wait till you see a prophecy find fulfillment. You should go right now to the Lord and accept Him as your Savior, because these things that we're talking about are stage setting right now, and they're about to happen. And you should use them as a witnessing tool to not only for yourself but to your loved ones, to be drawn toward the Lord, to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, because He loves you and He cares for you, and that's what He wants you to do.
Bill's here. We're recording a few other programs, and you'll be seeing those subsequently. But, at the end of the day, we don't apologize for being prophecy watchers. That's what Jesus told us to do. And it's not just watching either. I think about this gentleman that you mentioned that, granted, he's watching for Damascus to be destroyed, but that's not the whole picture. The rest of the picture is Jesus said to be ready. And that's the key, is to be ready at all times, at any moment, because that's the beauty of Jesus' teaching as it relates to the rapture, that it can happen any moment, and He expects His people to be ready so that when He comes, He'll be able to take, again, all believers who have been watching already with Him. So we appreciate you watching. We will continue to do that. We ask for your prayers, as always, and please look for us. We are on a variety of places. You can find us on Roku. Certainly we have different television stations that we're on. You can find us on Rumble as well, and our app, prophecywatchers.com. You can go there. So appreciate you watching, and we will see you next time.